Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Business of Compliance podcast, the podcast by executives for executives like you. Today, we are absolutely honored to welcome two special guests, Kevin Shinner and Tom McNamara. And guys, before I butcher the intros for the executives listening today, maybe I could turn this over to you for just a moment and have you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself. Tom, maybe we could start with you, if that works.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having us on, Patrick. So I'm Tom McNamara, the CEO and founder here at Attoro. We're essentially a cyber compliance agency, and we work with the ISO standards, SOC 2, GDPR, I suppose recently ISO 42001. Background-wise, I've been in compliance for over 14 years, started out in financial services compliance. Started out in the dark days when we were known as the ABU, or the anti-business unit, and happy to see that things have evolved since then. I suppose originally I would have been deeply involved in regulatory horizon scanning, so working on regulations like the money laundering regulation, FATCA, PSD2, and then GDPR. GDPR was really my aha moment around setting up my own business. And that kind of led to the foundation of Attoro, where we jumped in, very much focused on GDPR to begin with, and then branched out into security and now AI governance to really bring together that full suite of cyber compliance agencies or services. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. And I do want to pin so that we can jump back to this idea of you recognizing a gap in the market, a place to step in and offer value. I think that's critically important. So as dialogue progresses, I'd love to come back to that. Before we do, though, Kevin Shinners. Kevin, thanks for making time today. But would you care to tell our listeners just a little bit about you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Shinners. I am the Divisional Vice President for Align for EMEA and APAC. I've been in Align for 9 months now. My background is primarily on the risk management side for 20 years or so. This is I suppose an exciting place to be for the right reasons and not necessarily the right reasons for our clients in all cases. I think there's a lot of regulations out there. There's a lot of new things happening, but there's also a lot of misinformation and a lot of things which people are still learning. With the new regulations coming in Europe, NIS2 and DORA, the new AI regulation, ISO 42001, there's a whole plethora of new things in addition to everything which is there already today. So yeah, it's a very interesting journey to be on, and very glad to be here.
Kevin, thank you. And actually, you just mentioned something that I think is very top of mind for a lot of organizations because of looming deadlines, and that's NIS2, but more specifically DORA. I think with DORA, we're working against a 17 January 2025 deadline. Guys, as you think about the conversations that you're having with executives in your space, in your market, I mean, is this a pressing concern, or are people really just now starting to open their eyes to what it means to be in conformance to the new requirements?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. I think the first element is why NIS2 and DORA? Why not just one? I think NIS2 is obviously an extension of the original NIS regulation or NIS law, and the two major changes for that are scope and sanctions. Scope has significantly increased to include different industries. And the sanctions have become very punitive, but also punitive at a senior management level within companies. And then when you look across to DORA, you can be required to adhere to both NIS2 and DORA if you're a financial institution. DORA is basically looking at anybody within the finance industry. So whether you're a fintech company, pension fund, insurance fund, bank, there's at a very, very low estimate, there's at least 25,000 companies in scope for DORA. This is a very, very big marketplace. And it's a very scary marketplace because, as you said, it's coming into scope and into force very, very soon. It is low, so there is no option. You must adhere to these things. And the sanctions are very punitive. Senior management sanctions are basically you are designating senior or influential people within the company, and they are personally liable if something happens. And that's the first time I've ever seen a situation where that sanction is coming in place. So NIS has moved into NIS2 because sanctions are becoming more punitive and the scope has been widened. And then DORA is coming along because from a financial perspective, obviously, if you look back to 2008 and the financial crisis, the banks and the financial industry in general have a very, very punitive effect on the rest of the market if something goes wrong. So it's, I suppose, increasingly important to make sure that they're kept top of mind from a cyber perspective.
Yeah, and Kevin, a couple of times you mentioned a word that is really resonating with me, or words that really resonate with me. You mentioned punitive damages, you mentioned sanctions. There's this whole idea of motivation direction, that as leaders, we'll either try to move our organization towards something positive or away from something negative. And it feels very much like these regulations are heavy on move away from the negative. For executives out there listening, I mean, are there positive things? Is there a way to frame these new requirements in a positive way so that organizations can make direct decisions, that is, about what they want to create versus what they want to avoid?
Yeah, it certainly can feel, look, and sound like it's completely punitive. The reality is it's nothing dramatically different from what companies are or should be doing today. So take NIS2, for example. It's across every real industry type. If you're working in the EU, if you've got an office in the EU, or you're doing business within the EU, you're in scope. So it doesn't matter where you're actually located. If you're doing any one of those three things, you are in scope. What is actually apparent is that there are 10 major criteria required for NIS2. All 10 of those criteria are met at a baseline fundamental level by ISO 27001. So it isn't necessarily a case.
No kidding.
You're not looking at this as going, this is something brand new. This is a new certification I have to go through from scratch. It's nothing like something we have already. This is simply, or should be, an extension of what people are already doing. Now, 27001 is the baseline. It gets you in the door. Then there's additional requirements around business continuity, which obviously with the recent CrowdStrike issue becomes probably even more topical.
Global outages as of today, yeah.
So then you got 22301, which would adhere to that. You've got SOC 2 for compliance, same thing. That would be applicable in other situations. But it's really just about mapping the main controls that are required within both NIS2 and DORA to what you have today and making sure that they apply. And a lot of people will do this today. From an external audit perspective, you're now also required to do an internal audit perspective. From an internal audit perspective, to do the same thing. So there are nuances within this. There are additions and scope creep within this, which people have to be aware of. And the timeline isn't too far away. For both of them, we're looking at end of this Q4 of 2024 being implemented into local law within each country within the EU, and then Q1 of 2025 it being implemented into law properly. So yeah, we don't have much time.
And Tom, from a boots on the ground perspective, as you're dealing with execs, Kevin, it kind of feels like ISO 27001 that forms the foundation of how we need to think about DORA. 22301 to supplement from a business continuity perspective. Kev, as we think about prevalence of certification to ISO 27001 and the customers you're serving, have many moved that direction, or many considering moving that direction? How are they actually thinking about building a baseline governance and management system so they can be effective as regulation continues to evolve?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think what we are seeing is that we did a survey recently internally, our compliance benchmark survey, and what we're seeing is over 50% of companies, their compliance function lives within their IT part of the business. So there's a very, very small component of companies which have a dedicated compliance function, and that is a challenge because obviously it impacts your ability to build out compliance holistically. When you look at that from a new regulation or new law perspective, it becomes even more topical because it's less about your I suppose knee-jerk reaction. It's more about looking at this holistically across the board as to how the company overall is trying to implement these laws. Like if you look back, if you're looking at the finance industry in general, 20 years ago within the finance industry, there was one guy in a risk department and it was his job to make sure the company didn't go under, and he was responsible if something went wrong.
Had that job before.
That's how it was 20 years ago. But actually, if you look forward now to where the finance industry is, everything is risk adjusted. All returns are risk adjusted. there's a much more knowledgeable base of information across the entire company, from front office all the way to middle office and back office. So there's definitely been a cultural shift within the finance industry. I think we're going to see the same type of cultural shift from a compliance perspective as well over the next decade or so, where people move away from having a CISO or somebody who's got that title or got that role, and it's their job to make sure nothing goes wrong, to being something that culturally is impacting across the entire company. Because the reality is, from a compliance perspective, you can have all the controls, you can have all the policies and procedures in place that you want. But if people aren't adhering to them, if they're still clicking on the wrong things, if they're still doing the wrong things in the wrong ways, you're still exposing your company pretty fundamentally to a wide range of different nefarious alternatives. So I think the world itself is changing.
Tom, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, man. I think you get the frontline perspective of what these execs are really dealing with these implementations.
Yeah, it's funny, like you look at a lot of different regulations and they all have a base somewhere. So we recently did a project down in Australia for their trusted identity framework. And you could just see elements of GDPR, you could just see elements of ISO 27001 and just different influences coming in to how the frameworks were actually set up. And I think Kevin made a good point, like looking back at financial services and seeing how a risk officer operates and the likes of that. You know, we had a conversation, I think, offline, Pat, around where would AI governance sit? Would it be in the privacy office? Would it be in the security office, which traditionally goes down towards engineering and the CTO? When realistically, with the onslaught of regulations, a centralized office that's covering risk and like cyber risk across the business is probably the direction that companies want to go to. But in terms of like tackling specific obligations across different regulations, like Kevin mentioned, there's usually a lot of good work already there. You're just figuring out, what you're doing already, what you're doing well, and how that overlaps. And obviously, in some cases, you need to meet a standard or a certification. In other cases, you need to satisfy your board, you're in compliance with law. So I suppose there's a bit of overwhelm, but I think coming from financial services, as I said, my background was regulatory scanning. The idea of horizon scanning was there's always going to be more regulations coming. How do we look at this? How do we understand how we're going to adopt to it? What do we already have in place? So it depends on kind of what company you're working for. If you're working with a fintech or financial services, they probably are well aware of things. If you're working with a tech company, there's usually longer, maybe harder conversations that need to be had.
Yeah, and guys, as we're talking through this, ISACA defines governance as a value creation process. And ISACA says through COBIT, look, governance value creation is about creating desired outcomes at an optimized risk and cost. So 3 variables. What do we really want to create? Does it align with our business? What risk are we willing to accept? And kind of what budget do we have to make these changes to affect the change in our future that we want to affect? And at least in my experience, most organizations get ends means confusion and jump straight to budget or jump straight to risk without thinking about what it is they really want to create. I don't know if that's something that you've run into. I mean, if so, how can we help executives think differently about approaching their compliance and their external regulatory obligations strategically?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm going to go first.
I suppose, it depends if you're looking towards a framework or a standard versus a law. We're kind of getting, the EU AI Act and ISO 42001. It's a good example. So you've got your framework, which you can be certified against, and then you've got your law, which obviously there's reporting requirements and it's quite prescriptive, but there's probably more wiggle room inside of that in terms of how we interpret our responsibility. I think it's important to think about, are we going to get tested on this versus do we just make sure we don't fail on this? Right. And then that will really drive kind of your incentives and how you're going to approach things.
And Kev, before you go, for listeners, Tom just mentioned something really important because of the timeliness of this video. The AI Act was written into the EU official journal last week. It has an effective date of August 1st. So not to give an impending date to add additional pressure, but the clock is very much ticking. You need to make a decision today about how you will effectively govern AI and start taking action. Please do not wait. 6 months will be here before we know it, as will full enforcement. So don't let time slip away. All right, Kevin, I'm sorry for the shameless plug for people to think about what's coming. Yeah. Back over to you, man.
Listen, I think in general, when you look at cybersecurity, I think there's two major levers to pull. One is law. Effectively, it could be looked at as being equivalent to tick a box. You've no choice. You have to do it. You have to do it in a very, very certain prescribed way. And if you do it that way, then obviously you avoid punitive issues, you avoid sanctions, you avoid all that negative stuff. The other way is from a, I suppose, strategic perspective, it's insurance. You're trying to avoid situations where you have exposure, or you're minimizing exposure. Like, you can never get rid of risk. There's always going to be risk there. It's about minimizing and mitigating exposure where you can. And think of the cybersecurity elements as being the insurance against that. It's minimizing the damage. It's minimizing the chances that these things happen. You're not going to be fully gone, but you're certainly doing what you can within the company to minimize that. In both of those situations, being very pragmatic about it, what you want to do is you want to impact revenues for the company as positively as possible. Either because you're now adhering to new frameworks or new standards you didn't cover before, because as an EU company, you want to do business in the US, so you might start doing SOC 2, for example. Or you want to avoid a situation where you are getting sanctioned, or you are exposed to something that you probably shouldn't have been exposed to, which has obviously a direct impact on your revenues, and can also have a direct indirect impact on the revenues, because you could have, obviously, from a brand perspective, you could have an impact on brand and the comfort level people would have of doing business with your brand. So I think if you look at it from a law... Reputation, absolutely. So look at it from a law perspective and or an insurance perspective, they're the two major characteristics, but they both roll up to the same thing. You don't want to reduce revenues by getting sanctioned or by having reputational risk included. And you want to find other ways to use them to increase your return.
And then, Tom, as you think about this, are executives really thinking this way today? And I only ask because, at least in my experience, planning still seems to be largely transactional around allocated budget. People still limit their thinking about what they can create based on the budget they currently have, not what they need. I don't know if that's something that you've experienced as well.
Yeah, like, for better, for worse, well, no, mainly for worse, you're still looking at compliance and even security to an extent as a cost center in certain organizations, as opposed to really looking at the value add that can be brought, opening up new markets like Kevin mentioned, or, being able to offer new solutions and the likes. So it can be really like a catalyst, but in general, do more with less seems to be the common phrase when you're talking about security and compliance. People do want the belts and braces approach, but then budget tends to be a stickler, like on how far they're willing to get towards those objectives.
But I always find that funny when you say, like, when you talk about doing more with less, and you hear this from clients quite a lot of, well, we'll kind of try and get by with what we're doing today and how we're doing it today. Well, then the question is, how are you?
Efficiencies.
Yeah, because a lot of times, well, we've got half of our team spending all of their time filling out these cybersecurity questionnaires. The other half of the team are trying to figure out why our competitors are winning more business than we're winning. So yes, you can do things the way you've done it today because it is knee-jerk reaction. It is like, what is the most pressing fire that we need to put out? But when you take a step back and look at it holistically, there are definitely much better ways of probably spending the same amount of money or something equivalent to the same amount of money, but getting a much better return on your investment. The challenge is always trying to step back a bit and actually see that.
Let's step out of the chaos and actually see what's what. I tell the story. Early in my career, I worked for a company that had decided that we were going to stand up a side business of selling and provisioning T1 lines. It was a big deal here for a while before broadband was prevalent. Well, we were losing money on every line we sold, but our thought was we could make it up in volume, not necessarily understanding that doubling down on a broken process was just going to create more broken processes. And in so many ways, I think we see organizations doing that today. trying to be more efficient, but not creating the outcomes that they want to begin with. So what are we really doing here?
Yeah, I see a lot of that. Like I work a lot with startups as well and scale ups. So their initial investments tend to be, as cheap as possible. So they're buying template packs and they're trying to like upskill like engineers who already have like a 60-hour week. And they end up causing so much trouble for themselves in trying to interpret doing it on the cheap that they're either left with something that's wholly inefficient and it's actually becoming the typical slowing things down, people hate it, versus like an initial investment that would actually provide a program, just say if it's ISO 27001, like it's super flexible as a standard. So being able to go in, understand how it applies to the business, putting that kind of effort in to begin with, and then having a proper, continuous improvement, looking at year on year investment to build it up, and really having a strategy behind it versus, okay, let's just focus on budget or let's focus on, getting that certification over the line and not think about it as a really important part of like a growing business.
As hygiene in so many ways. And Tom, and not to put you on the spot, but for the listeners that maybe aren't that familiar with 27001, but maybe at a high level, you could just give a quick description so that they can understand how important this is for the health and longevity of their businesses.
So 27001, I think it's misinterpreted a lot. I look at it first as a quality management system, and then it's like layering on top of that information security management. So the idea of it is a framework to manage your security within a business, but it's not just a list of controls, whereas like SOC 2, for example, would be more control focused and the effectiveness of your controls. ISO 27001, it's a framework for implementing an information security management system with the big focus there on management system, because the whole clauses section is devoted to leadership buy-in, continuous improvement, self-governance in a way, and the likes of that. So that comes first, and then your security controls based on your risk assessment. So deep diving into the business, what type of risks you have as a business based on your stakeholders as well as your assets, bringing everything into play. So it's really a way to think about managing security, and done correctly, like it really will give you the basis to really scale up a business with it.
And Tom, based on what you're saying, I'm envisioning it being a way, the management system itself being a way to operationalize business aligned security controls, so that we're not, my papa at one point said to me, you could put a windshield wiper on a dog's butt, but at the end of the day, what do you really have? And I think a lot of organizations decide that they're going to add these bolt-ons that don't necessarily align with the business mission, the business values. But it sounds like creation of the management system for 27001 allows orgs to ensure that what they're implementing aligns with what they really want to create, so that it can be operationalized, so that it can provide real benefit.
I got it. When done correctly, it really is the blueprint for setting up a department within your business. In terms of a lot of companies, when they go around it the first time, they don't necessarily have dedicated security professionals. So they have to figure out, what way do we set up policy and procedure in a way that works and functions as an actual department. And then we can go and get people like A-Line in to certify that, okay, we've followed the standard. We've put in place business practices, which are best practices. The world does look up to ISO in terms of how it's been set up. And if you do it correctly, it's a really solid foundation for your management system.
And then, Kevin, based on that, it sounds like what you were saying earlier with DORA. So we lay down this effective baseline for governance and management inside our organization. And then we can simply layer on top additional controls or additional requirements based on external regulation. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a misconception as well that every regulation is different and every regulation is unique. And if you the reality is, when we look at what people are doing today, less than 10% of companies are actually adhering to one framework and one framework only. There's oftentimes they look at ISO 27001 to start with, and then they might look at, Cyber Essentials or SOC 2 or HITRUST or PCI or whatever it is, there's lots of them out there, and they look at them separately. And so if you want to adhere to 2 different regulations, it's twice as much work. The reality is there's an awful lot of underpinning information which is consistent across all these regulations. So you have the same HR policies and procedures. You have the same baseline IT policies and procedures. So depending on the regulations you're looking at, you could have 50% or more of the underlying evidence, which is consistent across multiple different frameworks. So when you look at DORA on top of it, some people might look and go, oh, this is another brand new thing we have to do. But in fact, it's not. As you said, it's underpinning, or it's being underpinned by the regulations and the frameworks you should already have in place. There might be some tweaks around the edges. There might be some inconsistencies that you have to take care of, but it shouldn't be a brand new undertaking. It shouldn't be additive to everything else that you have to do. This is something brand new, so we have to start everything from scratch. That shouldn't be the case. Some people do look at it like that, but unfortunately, it's just because they're not given the time or not able to spend the time to stand back and look at it a bit more holistically. And that's a challenge, because the only other alternative to doing it that way, in the additive way, is hire more people, hire more resources. And there is a massive, massive lack of like high quality cybersecurity resources today. Like there's, depending on the report you look at, it's between 300,000 and 500,000 cybersecurity personnel lacking in Europe right now. And that's only going to grow, obviously, with NIS2 and DORA. That gets even worse by Q1 of next year. So if you don't have that ability to consolidate and reduce the amount of work that you have to do, it does become quite challenging.
And Kevin, you mentioned something really important here, and that's the addition of additional standards to assess against, or additional frameworks to assess against, aren't necessarily one for one. It's not linear, if you will. Earlier, we were talking about the need to do more and more with less and less. It almost feels like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it almost feels like our executives really need to consider their compliance strategy to ensure that they can do more and more with less and less, and formulate a strategy that's right for their business and their market. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's very, very fair. And to give a very simple example, like the 2 most common cybersecurity frameworks on the market would be ISO 27001, which we've talked a lot about, very common in Europe. And the second one is SOC 2, which is very common in the US. If you're a European company, you want to do business in the US, which a lot of them do, the US companies you're looking to do business with will usually require you to be SOC 2 compliant as well, which sounds like a completely different framework, completely different requirements, and there are differences and significant difference in terms of the characteristics of how they're set up. But most importantly, from a client perspective, there is a 60 to 70% overlap in the evidence that you need between the 2 of those. So if you're adhering to ISO 27001 today, and you want to add on SOC 2 onto that, it's not 100% of additional work. You've already 60 to 70% of the evidence that you need for SOC 2 done, because you have ISO 27001. So you only have to add another 30 to 40% of evidence to become fully SOC 2 compliant. That's massive. That's a game changer for a lot of people. And it's the same thing for every other framework as well. Different percentages, different overlaps, but there's certainly significant overlap in a lot of the other ones as well. So people who are looking at this from a tactical, transactional perspective of, let's just get another auditor in, let's get another audit done, and just add more people, add more bodies to it, very quickly you will not run away. If you look at it strategically and try and map it overall to a consistent set of evidence frameworks and build from there, you can get to the stage where you can do an awful lot more for an awful lot less.
And for those executives listening, and Tom, it looked like you were about to talk. I'm so sorry. Just one thing for execs listening: external references. So everyone, Kevin just mentioned an overlap number. I will tell you, AICPA, the American Institute of CPAs, the governance organization associated with SOC 2, has published multiple mappings, multiple framework mappings. To Kevin's point, from AICPA, you can download a mapping of the current version of SOC 2 mapped to the current version of ISO 27001. And Kevin, the percentage is close to what you just mentioned. But for those executives that need to see this empirically, please download that cross-mapping document. I think you'd be surprised. Again, to Kevin's point, there is significant overlap, assuming sufficient scoping similarities, assuming we're talking about the same evaluative scoping. Nonetheless, there is a way to really, really reduce the burden that I think many of us assume is there that doesn't necessarily need to be. And then, Tom, I think I cut you off, man. I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. I was just going to jump in there. Like Kevin pretty much summarized the value add for a lot of these compliance automation tools like Vanta. You know, people have perceptions about what to achieve with them, like quick certification or whatever. But at its core, especially when you're looking at like mature compliance programs, you can start to build upon existing standards and existing controls within your organization and get that automated mapping and automated testing. So you're testing for passwords across all your standards. That's just one test within a platform like Vanta, and you can manage that from a dashboard. You can add multiple frameworks and compliance regulations to that all have the same controls, and you can see right in front of you, okay, we're already well set up for a lot of these. Now, there'll be individual controls that need to be adjusted, but compliance automation tools really do bring a lot of value in terms of scaling and tackling future compliance and future regulatory requirements.
And then, Tom, it sounds like it would be recommended for organizations that have yet to begin this process, if they don't already have one, to actually evaluate and acquire a GRC platform. Is that fair?
I think it's important, especially your first objective, to know what you want to do. That's why I really I'm an evangelist when it comes to ISO 27001. But like you guys mentioned previously, it's a framework, but then the controls can overlap with multiple other frameworks. It's also said in a way that you can keep adding controls to it. Just because it doesn't cover a specific control under ISO 27001's Annex A controls, you can add to that, and you're basically building up your management system. So
Okay.
I suppose back to your point around the investment, especially when you're first starting off, I think it's really important to understand that you have to build a program, and then you bring these tools in to automate and to help you monitor. But if you're looking at doing dual certifications, like if you're a startup that has global aspirations, you're going to need ISO 27001 on top of SOC 2. It makes a lot of sense. It does, after the initial investment and the setup, it does allow you to do more with less. You can monitor your security program. You can add additional frameworks and standards and automatically see, okay, we've got 65% of our compliance obligations done here already. And just the human involvement of monitoring compliance and maintaining compliance when you have a tool like this really is it's noticeable. One person can get a lot done when they do have a dashboard reporting their tests, their failures, who to chase even. So I think it's definitely, when I started off in compliance, I could have only dreamed like a platform like that. We were in SharePoint with folders and lists of controls and, scheduled emails to check
Total
things.
chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. That's how you describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, fellas, as I think about this, it's July. It'll be October before we know that many organizations are kind of in the season just before budgetary planning for next year. What do our executives need to be planning for from a compliance perspective? We know regulation is changing, so we know things are coming with DORA and NIS2. But in a perfect world, you take over as CEO of a new startup who's bringing value to customers in the EU. What are you planning? What are you budgeting for? What are you executing upon to ensure that you have a solid compliance strategy?
Yeah, I think work backwards from what we talked about earlier on. So we've talked about law, we've talked about the insurance aspect, we've talked about the impact of those things, but it comes back to revenues. So from a CEO's perspective, what's going to drive my revenues in 2025 and beyond? What are the things that really make an impact? And revenues is obviously growth in revenues, as well as what will consume my revenues. So additional headcount, potential fines and sanctions that need to get imposed. Try and balance that equation. How much do we want to grow? Where do we grow? And what will allow us to grow within those regions? We absolutely see it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about it as well, where people kind of be in a bit of a status quo effect of, we'll just do what we've always done. And we hear this a lot from clients as well, who say we want to do SOC 2, we want to do something, some other regulation. We've never lost business because of this. And then they go through the compliance framework, come out the other side, get accredited, post it on their website in their trust center, and then strangely they start getting invited to an awful lot more RFIs and RFPs.
A huge uptick in business.
So it is one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. But I think it has to come back to what are the things that are impacting the revenues of the company. What are the things you're doing today that you probably shouldn't be doing? You may have been doing them, X amount of time ago when you were very small, very startup, very nimble. But as you grow, is having 2-3 people filling out questionnaires for weeks or months on end the most beneficial and useful way of using their time? Or is there something more scalable that you can do? From a sanctions perspective as well, what do we want to avoid? And what we see an awful lot more of is those trust centers. A lot more people are publicizing what they do and how they do it. They're showing their badges for SOC 2, for ISO 27001, PCI, and they're creating effectively, it's like a marketing document on their website. It's a trust center that demonstrates we adhere to these frameworks. And they're doing that because they're looking at their competitors. And their competitors are showing that off as well. So it's a bit of a compare and contrast situation that we're in, where we don't want to necessarily, we don't want to have to do these things, but we see the necessity of doing it. And we can also see where the savings can come from on the other end internally with the costs, and also the potential increase in revenues from doing them too.
And then, Tom, I think your perspective on this is unique because not only are you serving executives of small businesses, but you are an executive of a small business. So, I mean, yeah, I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I suppose we work very much with SaaS companies, as I mentioned, and if you're a SaaS company that's using AI or integrating AI, you can't look past the UAI Act. If you were just setting out, or I was just setting out, understanding the landscape, and Kevin mentioned earlier around insurance, a big driver for the early stage certification. Before, even when we started 6 years ago, certification was post the Series A that you'd look at ISO, you'd look at SOC even. Now it's it's a cost of doing business nearly. And I think if I was starting out today, or I had a startup, you kind of have to factor in that pretty soon you're going to start getting asked for security certification. So what would it look like to set up a program? What type of investment? It's nearly part of those raising your seed round that we're going to have a security budget in here, even though investors probably won't like to see you coming with it. But
right.
So this is all, and again, it probably comes back to my regulatory horizon scanning, but just understanding where you're going as a business and what can come in to impact you is kind of what you need to do. And understanding the market, definitely looking at compliance platforms. We mentioned doing more with less, and AI really is a massive opportunity for compliance. And the executive in me, as we set down the road of ISO 42001 compliance with A-Line, I saw as the typical, we saw the opportunity to be early with 42001, kind of showcase that. Then we worked backwards as a company. We're how can we use more AI in the business to actually justify having a certification on top of it? And that's where we've been. But we've had really good conversations around the efficiencies in compliance that can be leveraged. We see a lot about questionnaire automation, having databases. One of the most, I guess, surprising aspect of the route that we've gone down on is the documentation management system. It's not the sexiest part of any sort of compliance framework, ISO 27001. We realized pretty quickly that having a strong documentation management system, that was the food for our AI models. So yes, as a business and a business brain, if all our internal memos are correctly labeled, then we're able to get much stronger in our AI models to say, this is an issue that continuously comes up. This is how it's responded to over and over again. And then we're building up that capability. So I guess I'm gone a little bit off topic, but that really kind of struck us as we were going down the route of 42,001 and 27,001 compliance, seeing how all that tied together.
No, and what I love about that kind of sidetrack, Tom, thinking about the indirect benefits of especially startups taking the time to plan their strategy. I was consulting with an AI startup yesterday who's negotiating for Series A right now. They showed me this list of demands of required certifications that they need in order to comfortably partner with this investor. And it was nonsense. I mean, the investor was looking for FedRAMP authorization, high trust certification, just this slew, because the investor doesn't know. But what startup executives can do by creating their own compliance strategy, you can formulate and articulate what's necessary for your business to compete in the market, and then comfortably say no to everything else. If we're not dealing with something that necessarily requires FedRAMP authorization, let's not undertake that burden. It's an expensive one. I mean, in some cases, it can be a fool's errand. So it really does arm executives that are listening. And I know not all of you are with startups, but for those of you listening, this is an opportunity to help you really crystallize your plan so that it can be communicated and defended when necessary. And then, guys, we're coming up on time a little bit. I can't believe time has flown. As you think about, again, 2025 and beyond, what are executives not thinking about today that you think they absolutely need to? What are we missing as a group of either compliance or business executives that are going to become issues for us if we don't take action?
I think the biggest one is consolidation. Tom mentioned at the start, these regulations are not going away. These frameworks are not. One doesn't replace another. One adds to another, to another, to another. So if you just do ISO 27001 today, okay, well, if you want to do business in the US, it'll be SOC 2. If you're using ChatGPT, at some stage on the road, it'll be ISO 40001. If you do business in Europe, it'll be NIS2 and or DORA. It's not going to get easier. It will get more tricky. So I think having that consolidation conversation internally about what that would look like and how to make that meaningful becomes incredibly important. Now, a big caveat on all of this is that you need to find an auditor that actually can do that with you.
Yes.
Tom mentioned earlier on from a technology perspective, you also need an auditor who can have that consolidation conversation with you as well. Because effectively how that would work is you'd have an ISO auditor and a SOC auditor from the same practice in the same room at the same time, reviewing the same set of evidence, having the same conversation with the control owners, and going back to their respective camps and completing their certification. If you were using two separate auditors for two separate frameworks, you cannot benefit from that overlap. So having one auditor that can handle both or multiple is absolutely key and crucial. But I think if you look at the new laws, NIS2 and DORA, the new regulations, ISO 42001, and everything else, are just what people have today. The amount of work people are going to have to do is incredibly big, and it's only getting bigger. The amount of people within this industry able to adhere to all of that doesn't exist. They're not there. So the only way of actually achieving those goals is through consolidation platform. And if you can do that, and if you can have that consolidation project, I think you really are well set up in comparison to your competitors and your peers, because a lot of people are at the start of that journey. We're obviously working with a lot of clients through that journey right now, where they're like, we've one client who's using one auditor for SOC 1, a different auditor for SOC 2, a different auditor for PCI, and a different auditor for 27001. They're like, we can't do this. We can't keep on doing this rhetoric of over and over and over again. 3 months, finish one of them, take a breath, turn the rack around, and straight into a second one, and then same thing in Q3 and Q4. It's not possible. It's not scalable. And it's not efficient. So I think everything we're talking about today really comes back to that consolidation question. If you can consolidate things, NIS2 and DORA become much less of a problem, as does adding new frameworks to help you to grow new revenues, new regions. If you can't, I think the problem just persists and probably gets bigger.
And Kev, I would layer into that. You mentioned the importance of a solid audit partner. I would argue that the solid audit partner, the solid advisory partner, Tom, like you and your organization, and the solid GRC partner those three pillars become critical, especially for organizations that are just beginning this journey or are early in this journey. For all the reasons that you mentioned with audit partners, the ability to look in context across an organization and really think strategically. What we see is working with incredible advisory partners like Attoro, Tom, helps us think more clearly and more quickly about what's being implemented. And we develop a rapport that allows us to move fast in benefit of our customer. The GRC partners, the platform, the technical efficiencies that are brought to bear really are incredible. Think about what Vanta's doing, what Drata is doing to affect a positive change on the market. And I really do feel like for those organizations that are struggling today to take a step back and really form a solid relationship with their auditors, with their advisors, and their GRC partners is a critical next step. Probably one of the most strategic things they can do. Tom, I don't know if you feel the same, if you feel different.
Just building on what you're saying there around consolidation within like whether it's a small startup or it's a multinational, really bringing together different stakeholders. So like we're seeing the overlap between, for example, AI regulation and security and privacy, how they're all three very distinct aspects of the same regulation. We do have frameworks that impact different parts of the business, but with significant overlap. So just like consolidating your audit partner to look at the same controls and from that kind of holistic view, having your either internal team or your external advisors that understand different facets of the business and what compliance means to them. I think if you're over reliant on lawyers for your compliance programs, I think that's probably it's a problem.
That's a problem.
I come from a legal background, so I can say that uh, honestly. And I think like originally I was always brought in as the go between legal and operations. But your operations people, your compliance people on the ground really should understand what the other departments are doing, because I think silos are just as prevalent today as they were back before connectivity, in terms you don't know what privacy is doing, and privacy spent a big budget on security aspects of GDPR while it's already been covered by the security team or the technical team who are implementing ISO, and you've got two sets of controls across the same business covering the same things. So I think just building on what Kevin says, having partners that understand the whole ecosystem and building up knowledge and teams internally that understands the business as a whole will definitely let you kind of do more with less.
It seems to be the theme of today. I thought
Well,
the
I
theme
think
would
at the
be
moment it's stuck in my head. I've heard it so much in the last couple of weeks.
I thought the theme would be DORA and NIS2, but it's actually do more and more with less and less. Leverage, big leverage for 2025. Well, guys, before we say our goodbyes for today, any final thoughts? Anything you think is absolutely critical for the executives listening to know?
I think the biggest thing is just perception. If you go back to finance 20 years ago and risk was a cost center, and like, why are we doing it? It's ticking the box to where it is now, and everything being, as I said, risk adjusted. I think it's the same thing from a compliance perspective, moving away from the mindset this is tick the box exercise. Why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. This will create longevity for our company. This will help us to grow revenues within our company, and ideally create differentiators against us and our competitors to allow us to grow even further, even faster. I think the return on investment you can have from having a really strong compliance program in place is incalculable. It can be massive.
Yes.
Rather than the transactional, this will cost us more to get this certificate. Look at the return that you can get off the back of that, because you can always do what you've always done, but you'll get the same output. If you change and try to be a bit more strategic about how you approach those certain situations, that can have very, very big effect very quickly.
Tom, final words?
I think it's all been said, but yeah, especially from the security point of view, making sure it makes sense for the business and ultimately you protect it. So it's good to have certifications and have like all the benefits around that, but looking at first principles at the protection that you're afforded to your business, and it's not just check boxes, it's actually protecting data, protecting your systems. should be the key objective.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time today. If you're okay with it, I'll add your LinkedIn and contact information to the show notes for our watchers and listeners. And guys, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, for sharing your vision. Not only am I grateful, but I'm certain our listeners are grateful as well. Guys, thank you so much. Hope you have an incredible day. We'll talk again soon.
Cheers, guys.
Bye now.
Okay, guys, don't